Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Murray, and I am a podcast consultant, host, and producer. And I'm so very pleased to be doing this virtual session for Podcast Movement to help you launch a better podcast. Now, we all know that a lot of people can go online and create a podcast. You can get equipment that's relatively cheap to launch your very first show, and then you just get a hosting service and upload it, and you're there, right? Well, it's true, just about anybody can do that. But what we're going to talk about today is doing better than a lot of people. We're going to have you learn how to develop, produce, and upload a better podcast. Because here's the thing. There are a lot of podcasts out there. It is kind of a crowded space. Now, depending on your topic, your specific niche may not be crowded, but you're still going to want to do things that stand out, draw attention, and you're going to want to do things that other podcasts perhaps didn't take the time to do, or at least do them better. And that's what we're going to talk about today, because obviously one of the first things that's going to happen is you're going to get new listeners, people that are going to try you out for the first time. And that means you need to make a really good impression. And this is your, coming down to your logo. This is coming down to the title of your show. And then when they hit play, what's that going to sound like? So that's some of the ideas we're going to talk about today. It's really about making that first impression, because if you're trying to draw attention to yourself with someone who listens to a lot of podcasts, they probably already have a sense to what they like and don't like and what's better than what they've heard. And what I'm trying to do today is to give you some tools and some ideas to develop a podcast that's going to make a really good first impression and keep someone listening, and hopefully, most of all, get them to subscribe to your podcast. So let's start with a couple of fundamentals that I'm sure you're familiar with, but I think it's worth reiterating them. When you're coming up with a show topic, pick something you're passionate about. You're going to want to pick a theme that will offer at least 45 topics a year, because if you're serious about gaining subscribers, you're going to want to be putting out content every week if possible. Now, you're going to take a break. There's going to be a situation where you might have to miss a week or something like that, and listeners understand that. But you need to try to prepare to be able to put out content throughout the whole year. So I'm saying instead of 52, let's shoot for around 45. One of the examples I like to use is if you want to do a podcast on Saturday morning cartoons, yeah, it's a great idea. But after a few weeks, you're going to run out of cartoons. And then what do you talk about? So it's just really, really important to make sure that you've got a topic that will give you things to talk about week after week, month after month, year after year. You're going to want a title that's unique and easily searchable. And what that means is you might have to get a little creative with your title, especially if you're in a space or maybe even an industry where there are some common terms and phrases that might pop up frequently in blogs and blog titles and websites and books and things of that nature. When you come up with a title, search for it in Google to make sure that that title isn't being used in several other places. And it's true, you might have to get creative. It's very important to think through what type of format your show needs to have. Make sure that it respects a listener's time, and then stick to it. I mean, if you're going to do an interview show, it doesn't hurt to do a mini segment perhaps in the beginning, maybe even the end, but you also want to keep that interview very, very focused, and you might be looking at maybe a 25, 30-minute show. It's very important to figure out what type of format you're going to have, be reasonable about the length of time, and then stick to that time each and every week. Now, if there are other podcasts that cover your theme or your topics, I think it's a good idea to listen to them to see what they're doing or to hear what they're doing. But I also think it's important not to listen to that and go, okay, that's what I need to do. I mean, feel free to pull some consistent things that are there that you think work really, really well. But at the same time, any place that you can put some creativity in your podcast, do it. Do it in the production elements, the bumpers, the open, how you choose to flow through the content during the course of an episode. If you can figure out ways to get creative, that's going to make a huge difference in what makes you stand out, especially in a crowded podcast space. Now, when I did my first podcast, I hosted it on my own. I did a lot of talking. Yeah, I don't have it up anymore. It's not so much that I'm embarrassed about it completely. That show actually provided me with some really good opportunities, but for the most part, it was a little long for me to be talking, at least alone, through most of the program. Fortunately, I had interviews in it a lot. But what does that mean? That means at that time I really didn't know what it took to get a co-host. And I talk to people about that. They say, well, I have no idea how I should go about getting a co-host. I don't have any friends that are interested in doing this with me, or they don't have time. And I need someone who's going to work off of me really well, someone who's as passionate as I am and can provide the listeners with some really good conversation and perspectives. Well, let me give you some tips on how to find a good co-host, because it's true. The chemistry between you and that other person is going to be part of that first impression. And we're going to talk a little more about that later as it relates to the format of the program. But when it comes to finding that person, one of the ways that you can go about finding a good podcast co-host is through places like Twitter or places on even Facebook. If you use Facebook or Twitter, you can obviously create posts that say, I'm looking for a co-host for my podcast. But what might be a good idea is if at least you have a template or the beginnings of a podcast website built that people can at least look at. On the front page it may say it's coming soon or something. You could write a post or a page that describes what you're looking for in your co-host and maybe even gives a little more description about the show. You can link that to your post on Facebook and Twitter when you say you're looking for a co-host. It also allows people to check out your podcast website. While you're on places like Twitter, you can be doing things like searching for profiles with specific keywords in them. Let's say your podcast is about content marketing. So in the Twitter search, you type in content marketing and you click the tab that says you're looking for people with those terms in their descriptions or things that they're tweeting about. And it'll show you a bunch of people that either have content marketing in their little biography or they've obviously been tweeting about it. And those are people you can follow. And if they follow you back, you can message them and say, would you like to be a co-host? Look for Facebook groups that talk about your passion, if they're out there. Maybe even LinkedIn might be a possibility. So try to make a connection with some of those people and reach out to them and say, hey, I'm doing this podcast. I'd like to see if you'd be interested in being a co-host. Now, that doesn't mean if they say, yes, I'm interested, you want to offer them the job immediately because you haven't even heard their voice yet. It may be a voice that doesn't complement yours, or they may not be that good of a conversationalist despite being really passionate about what you do. So just tell them you're going to do a test show as part of an audition process. So hook things up on Skype, record a fake topic or a topic on a fake show for about 10 or 15 minutes, and see what happens. Have the two of you discuss it, see what they say, see what you say, see if there's any chemistry happening, and that can prove to be a very good strategy for getting a co-host. If you get 3 or 4 people that you find on Twitter or other means, and you do all those auditions, 3 or 4 of them, you're likely going to find someone who's going to fit the bill. And it's going to be worth it because you took the time to make sure you got the right person. And that is going to be a key factor in making a good impression and making a better podcast. Obviously, another term or group that you can look for is podcasting. You might be able to find someone who's involved in a little podcast right now and would love the opportunity to join another one. Plus, if they're currently podcasting, you can go and check out their episodes and find out how good they are at being a host or a conversationalist. All right, so we have a concept, we have a co-host, we have a format, and we have a pretty good idea of how this show is going to run, how long it's going to go. So now we need to produce the show, and in the process, we want to make sure that those first few seconds are going to make a really good impression. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to listen to some fake podcast opens, and I want you to listen and see if you can pick up the 1 or 2 things that might run a new listener away. Here's our first example.
This is the Fake Podcast Show. Here's your host, Jeff.
Welcome to today's episode of the Fake Podcast Show. I'm Jeff, and I am so glad that you could join us today.
Okay, so what was wrong with that one? I mean, it might be hard to believe if you don't listen to a lot of podcasts, or it might depend on what type of podcast you listen to, but there are opens like that, where it's a really long strand of music, and you just don't hear anything for 30, 40, 50, 60 seconds, and you begin to wonder, am I listening to a radio show or the beginning of a podcast program? And there are people out there that are going to be picky enough, and rightfully so, that after about 20, 30 seconds of just music and no welcome to the program or voiceover telling people what they're about to hear, they're out. So make sure that you don't do that. Make sure that you have a nice music bed, but someone needs to be speaking really, really soon to tell people what they're in for. And if they're not hearing anybody talking after the first few seconds, that could play a huge role in whether or not they stick with your podcast. And at that point, you definitely haven't made a better podcast. So here is our second audio clip.
Welcome to the Fake Podcast Show, dedicated to enlightening conversations and engaging interviews. Content with you in mind. Here's your host, George.
Welcome to the Fake Podcast Show. Thanks for listening to the program today. I'm your host. We have a full agenda for you today, and I think you're going to enjoy all of it. First off, we have a special guest interview that'll feature some very interesting points about our topic.
It was probably pretty easy to pick out what happened there and what's wrong there. But again, I've heard this in a podcast. And granted, the open was pretty awesome. I mean, it was a good, high-quality open. But that gets flushed down the toilet the moment that the host actually speaks, because there's a huge disconnect. You have the nice open that makes you think this is professional and really good, and then it fades out, and then you hear the host audio, and then suddenly it's a completely different program. So what I'm suggesting to you is make sure that you've got things in place that make that open sound really good, and that your audio is as good as it can be coming out of it. I mean, it doesn't have to be broadcast quality NPR if that's something that you're not capable of doing, but don't make it so far on the other end that it's a disconnect from what people just heard in the open. Here's the next example.
This is the Fake Podcast Show, the podcast that provides you with in-depth perspectives on today's hot topics. Now, let's join your hosts, Jeff and Jen.
Welcome to the Fake Podcast Show. This is episode 35 of the podcast, and we're so glad you're with us today. As always, I'm joined on the program by Jen. Hello, Jen.
Hello, Jeff.
How's it going?
Good. Can't believe we're on episode 35 already, though. It feels like it was just yesterday when we decided to do the podcast.
I know, it's been an incredible run so far. We've been able to talk about so many great topics.
We have, and I really can't wait to talk about our topics today because I already have opinions.
Good to know. Well, I am anxious to hear those opinions. So let's get started with today's episode.
Sounds good. I'm ready.
Again, something that was probably really easy to notice. And keep in mind, as you're listening to that, if you're a new listener, are you bothered by what you just heard? Of course you are. But I'm telling you, I've heard this on other podcasts. In fact, I heard one a few weeks ago that had this very problem. You've got audio inconsistencies. The levels are like this, which means the listener, if they're listening in their car, for example, are going to be turning the volume up, down, up, down, up, down as each person talks. You don't want to put them through that. So this is a simple process of doing one or two things. If you have access to a mixer, you can monitor that stuff. But if not, I mean, you've got tools in programs like Audacity or Adobe Audition that will help you do things like normalize your audio. I mean, if you import an audio file into an editor, you're going to see host one, his audio has this, these really big waves, and then when the other person talks, there's really small waves. Increase the audio of one or decrease the audio of the other, and then normalize it so your audio doesn't sound like that and you're not putting the listener through an exercise just to listen to your program. So my podcast network is focused on geek culture, and that means, movies, television, comic books, Star Wars, video games. So in this next fake audio clip. This is a comic book podcast that you're listening to, obviously for the first time, and I want you to see if you can pick up on what's wrong with the first impression coming out of this show. The audio's pretty good, the open's pretty good, but there's something else wrong here in this comic book show.
This is the Fake Comic Book Podcast, your number one source for comic book news and talk. Now, let's get ready to geek out about all things comic books with Jeff, Jen, and Tim.
Hello and welcome to the Fake Comic Book Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Jeff, and I'm joined today by Tim.
Hi, everyone.
And Jen is with us today as well.
Hello.
I have to tell you guys that you might have to do all the talking today.
Why is that?
What else is new?
No, seriously, I just ordered a pizza from my favorite restaurant, and it's consuming about 90% of my attention.
You're always eating pizza.
Okay, two things. First, I'm not always eating pizza. B, if I am, it's because pizza is the perfect food.
Okay.
You got. Let me guess which kind you got. You got the pepperoni and smoked oyster.
No, I had to stop with the smoked oysters after last time.
Mushroom.
But Jen is half right. Mushroom and sausage.
Whoa,
That's my
a
kind of
dangerous
pizza.
combination. Yeah.
Yeah, and the sad part is my favorite pizza restaurant is actually Domino's, which a lot of people don't know, and I realize that it's kind of lame, but it's close, and they get it here within 20 minutes of me ordering it. Like, I'm not even joking.
Always
Oh.
Domino's.
Always Domino's.
See, I had an issue with them one time. I ended up biting into it, and I found. I mean, I swear, it had to be like it was a hair, and it was about 4 feet long.
Oh, ew. My mom had that happen with Sonic one time. When I was a kid, I didn't have Sonic until I was about 12 years old because my mom went to Sonic one time, I think before I was born, got home with had a big hairball in her burger and refused to go back.
Oh,
I didn't have, and finally, when I was about 12 years old, I talked her into going back. And from that point on, she had no problem with it. But yeah, it was, deprived me of Sonic for the first decade or so of my life.
but I still go back. I'll try anything twice.
All of these places I've had food at, and I'm not sure I'm going to go back now. Thank you.
So, what's everybody doing other than eating pizza?
Oh, I was watching Tombstone before we started recording. You guys have seen Tombstone, right?
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know why. I just had the urge to watch it. The scene where Kurt Russell is punking up Billy Bob Thornton. Where he says,
yeah.
I said, "Throw down, boy," and slaps him and goes, "You gonna do something, or you just gonna stand there and bleed all day?" God, I love that movie.
We still
How
love
awesome
that
is
line.
Val Kilmer in that movie?
Oh yeah, I'm your Huckleberry. Yeah, I love that line.
All right, so what do you think happened there? You're tuning in to hear a great conversation about comic books. Did we ever get there? No. And that is also a common problem I find in podcasts, where people aren't getting to their theme or their topic fast enough at the beginning of the show. It's not to suggest that you have to just immediately dive right in where you feel rushed. I mean, feel free to say hi, share a little story about yourself, or if you want to kind of break the ice at the beginning of the program, that's fine. But get to the topic as soon as possible. I keep finding podcasts where it's almost like you're listening to a morning radio talk show and they're just goofing off, and maybe they're going to do a prank call or something, or maybe I'm just eavesdropping and people just hanging out talking when I thought I was going to hear a conversation about, in this case, comic books. So the key there to making a better podcast is get to your topics, get to your theme. People are there to hear you talk about what you say you were going to talk about, so it's really important that you do that. One of the best ways you can grow your audience for your podcast is to conduct interviews. And the main reason for that is, the hope is that when your guest comes on and you upload the show after you're done, that they're going to hit their social media channels and say, "Hey, I was just on this show, here's the link, check it out." And suddenly a lot of those people are going to know about your podcast, and maybe they'll even stick around and listen to some more of your episodes if they like what they hear. But if you're looking to conduct interviews, there's some things you can do to make your show stand out. And that includes not only booking some big name guests, but also the quality of the interview that you decide to conduct each and every week. Now, this is what I did and my first show, I mean, I was just a little bitty show to say the least. I was just starting out. I decided I wanted to interview people in the movies and TV industry and have them on the show. It was about every other week. And I had to figure out a way to book guests. One of the ways that I did that early on was I developed a track record. I actually have a couple of friends in town that did some Hollywood movies, and I asked them to be on my show. I was able to just call them and ask them to be on. And they agreed to come on, and they were my first couple of guests. I also went to a comic convention and got a quick interview with Brent Spiner from Star Trek The Next Generation, and that was my other guest. But then after that was over, I was able to send emails to publicists and managers and say, I'd like to have your client on my show. Look at the people who've already been on it. And that gives me instant credibility because I'm developing a track record. And it makes future guests feel a little safer and a little more comfortable coming on the program. Once I developed a track record, I was booking guests for every single episode, almost. I would miss one every once in a while, but suddenly I was booking people just about every show. And the more people I booked, the better my track record was, and the more I was able to showcase on my podcast website. The other thing that was key was I got a toll-free number from a service called Call 8. And this way, if the guest has to call me, I provided them with a toll-free number. That way, they can call me on that number without having to call like my home number. It also makes things look just a little more official. You have a toll-free guest line. It just sounds better than call me at home. Like I said, you'll be able to highlight your track record either by mentioning a couple of guests in your pitch email, or maybe you'll just be able to see some previous guests on your website. So when you send that pitch email, you can send obviously a link to your podcast site. But when you ask someone to be on your show, whether it's a manager, a publicist, or maybe you're able to contact them directly, keep things short, focused, and concise. Tell them how long the interview is going to be, whether it's through phone or Skype. It might be up to them whether they would rather do phone or Skype. What you want to talk about. Let them know that you will plug other things in the program, like maybe their charity, their website, their new book, or what have you. Tell them that you'll provide them that number and maybe even your cell phone as a backup number. Those are all really, really good things to highlight in a pitch email. When it comes time to do the actual interview, if at all possible, I realize this may not be true with every industry, but if you can find other interviews they've done in the past, especially if they are interviewed often, research those so you're not repeating a lot of the same questions they're used to being asked. Also, do everything you can to research that guest. You might be bringing somebody on because they're an author and they're writing about a very key focused thing that they're known for, but they might have other accomplishments in their life that you might want to highlight. I know that I've talked to actors that are known for a film, but they also happen to have a music career on the side. And when I bring that up, they're really happy to talk about it because not everybody does the research and ask them about that. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. But it's really important to come up with good quality questions that are going to make that guest think. Now, granted, you're probably not going to think of a whole lot of questions sometimes that they've never been asked, but even if you're asking the same question, just wording it a little differently that makes them think about it a little different can make all the difference in the world. Think about the things that you might want to know if you're a listener, which I tell people is a really key element to making your podcast stand out in everything you do. Make all your decisions audience-driven. Think about, if I'm hearing this, why does this interest me? Why does this engage me? Same is true with interviews. What do you like about interviews? I mean, make sure that you don't use the same phrase over and over again. Like, what was it like to work with this person? What was it like to write this book? What was it like to do this? Suddenly you're asking, what was it like all the time? I see that happen. So do research other interviews that they've done, and come up with the most insightful and sometimes even really creative questions you can to create what should be more of a good engaging conversation and not just a stoic QA, QA, QA. It can make a world of difference, and they'll appreciate it, they'll remember you for it, and then if somebody decides to listen to a prior interview before agreeing to come on your show, they'll be impressed with the type of questions you ask. And that's another reason why, by doing this, you'll have a better podcast. Obviously, before someone even hits play, they have to find you, and they have to like where they found you and what they see, obviously. When I was at a podcast conference not long ago, I heard a panelist say, if you have a $500 budget, spend $450 on a logo. I think that should tell you how important logo artwork is. It's very, very important. Now, granted, not all of us have access to a graphic designer, but let me tell you, if you use programs like Canva, PicMonkey, and maybe even some free photo services like Pixabay, although Canva offers quite a bit of pictures, even for $1 or less, like free, that you can use, and just put it on a square that's 1400 by 1400, create your own logo. It doesn't have to be an award-winning thing. What it does have to be is something that's easy to see, easy to read, and gives the listener a good sense as to what your show is right as they glance at it, either through the title or the artwork. And by the way, 1400 by 1400 is the size you're going to have to use, but before you hit save and say, that's my logo, shrink that thing down to about 150 by 150 or maybe even 125, and see if you can still read the text on the logo, because that is something that will be very, very important when iTunes shrinks that logo down to fit in its library, and then of course appear in iTunes and MP3 players and devices that people listen to their podcasts on. Another key element to making a good first impression on a potential new listener is your website. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a new podcast website and I'm having a heck of a time just figuring out where to listen to this thing. You know, they don't have a player, or I have to click 3 or 4 things and then maybe hit the right link or something and it might play or it might download. It's like a hunt for an episode. You know, if I just want to stream it and hear it for the first time right off of the website. Don't do that. Make a nice website. Put something on the front where people can test your show out. Put descriptions up there. You know, look at a lot of the things that people do when it comes to their podcast websites. Some really good examples. But really make it easy for someone as quick as possible to hit play and check out your show. A lot of podcast hosts will give you HTML codes and players that you can feature not only on your front page, but if you do a blog roll of episodes, you can put a player for each episode with all the show notes and information, which, by the way, you should also do. That's a great way that you can provide even more good information in your episodes as show notes with links. And then obviously if you have a guest, they're going to want things linked back to them, whether it be a website or a book or something, and that's where you can do it. But make those things easy to find on your website. It makes a huge difference, and it's a big part of making a good impression. I will tell you that I've seen in my statistics that the top 2 ways that people are listening to my shows, iTunes, obviously, and something that's called Apple Core. And what Apple Core means is people are opening their devices, a phone or a tablet, and they're streaming the program on the website from their device, because we make it very easy for people to be able to find an episode to listen to or search through episodes pretty easily. And by the way, all of my content on my website was created through Weebly, not WordPress. That's nothing against WordPress. WordPress is a fantastic website builder. You just got to know it forwards and backwards, I think, to really make the best use out of it. And I do think it intimidates people that just have some challenges with it because they're not used to the WordPress engine. But it's great. What I'm trying to tell you is you don't have to use WordPress for your podcast website. You can use a Weebly or a Wix or a Squarespace or whatever you'd like to use, because you're going to get that HTML code and you're going to be able to give people a place to listen to the show no matter what you build the program on or what you build your site on. And that's what's key. So you can build your own website. Just make sure it's easy to play your episode. All right, so the last thing we're going to talk about is post-production. I am really, 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 really big on this. I am somewhat of a snob even when it comes to post-production. I really believe in editing. And when I say editing, I don't mean just in post-production. I actually think you can do some of your editing before you even record just by doing what we talked about earlier, which is deciding I'm going to do 3-segment show. This is going to be around 10 minutes. This is going to be around 20 minutes. And then the last segment's going to be about 5 to 8 minutes. And then I'm going to stick to that and make sure I'm sticking to that. You can watch how long you're recording when you record something, even on Skype. Follow that, and you're going to save yourself a lot of editing time. But when I go into post-production, I'm doing several things in my editing. When I see people asking for podcast editor help, a lot of times I hear people say, well, I need someone to come in and remove the uhs and the ohs and uhs and stutters and things to tighten it all up. That's okay. That's all fine and good. But by the way, I think you can leave in a couple of those uhs and even stumbles on occasion, just because I think the listener considers a lot of podcasts to be a little more casual, and they like you to sound a little more real and not too polished. So leave a couple of those in there. I think it's actually okay. What I would focus on is if you have a co-host or you have 2 or 3 people that are talking about something and you veer off topic and then come back, maybe you go in and just cut out that entire portion where you veered off and then reconnect it in a way that flows well, just to keep the conversation moving and the show moving. Sometimes you can cut out things, side notes that weren't important, conversational elements that weren't important, getting off track that was fun at the time because it was just natural flow of conversation. But remember, we're talking about your listener. And listeners will really appreciate it if you take the extra time to make sure that all elements of conversation and production in the show move at a good pace and stay focused, and they will stay engaged. They won't wander, they won't bail, or at least they're less likely to, if you take that extra time. And trust me, I've been told, I put a ton of work into mine, and I have listeners tell me that they can tell how much effort goes into the post-production elements, including how the show flows, and they appreciate it. You know, I've never bought into the notion where someone says, oh no, we really like your extra long episodes. There's nothing wrong with respecting your listeners' time. Keep in mind that the average commute time, last time I checked, one way in the United States, I think Cliff Ravenscraft recently said it was around 30 minutes. Okay? So if your show ends up being an hour and a half, 2 hours long, you're asking a lot, and you need to make sure that you've got good content there that they are going to feel like is worth giving you that much time. Now, granted, not the work commute's not the only time people listen, but for some it very well may be, and that's a lot of time. So make sure you're respecting the time they're giving you by just putting a little extra effort into pre-planning how the show's going to go and then editing and post-production. Here's another thing. I think it's pretty safe to say that the space I'm in with my geek talk shows, that's a pretty crowded space these days. I don't think I need to convince you of that. There's a ton of geek culture podcasts. So what does that mean? That means if someone comes to check my show out, in all likelihood, they've already got geek shows in their queue. So what am I doing that's going to convince them to stick me into that time as well? Well, if I respect their time and I give them a good quality show, those things are going to help me convince them to add me to their queue because I made a much better podcast right out of the gate, and I didn't have to learn this as I went along. But by the way, don't get me wrong, it is perfectly okay to tweak and adjust and say, we could be doing that better, or maybe this isn't working, and continue to learn how to make your podcast better. It doesn't mean this isn't about mastering your show right out of the gate with no problems. By all means, think of new things to offer to your listeners. Think of new ways to enhance your program or enhance the experience, and continue to learn some great things that you find out there that other podcasters are doing, or maybe things that people are looking for in their content, and see if you can offer that in your program. Another thing that I've heard people suggest, and I think this is a really good suggestion, I think Cliff Ravenscraft has also talked about this, if I might mention him again, it might be a good idea to record your first few shows and maybe make your 6th or 7th show the first one you give to the public, because you very well may tweak things so much between episodes 1 and 5, or maybe even 7, 8, and 9, that things may sound completely different when you get into episodes 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I will tell you, this happened to me. This totally happened to me. That same show I talked about earlier, I was messing with the format like crazy my first 5 shows. And then when I suddenly realized I was going to be booking guests, I was actually having some success booking guests each and every show, because I didn't know if I was going to get that. And I was trying to come up with ways to get around it. But then suddenly, what I thought was a talk and maybe quasi-interview show on occasion turned out to be a consistent interview show. And by the time I got to my 7th episode, I realized that my show was now completely different from what I heard episodes 1 through 5. And it was so different, I deleted the first 6 episodes after a while, because I wanted the very first thing for people to hear was that 7th episode, not those first 5. And I realized it was going to be confusing because I probably referenced older shows. I didn't care. But if I'd done what I just suggested, if I had done those first few shows, especially with my friends, and then did episode 7, that would have been awesome. My 7th episode was an interview with Mayim Bialik from The Big Bang Theory. This was back when Amy Farrah Fowler's character was just introduced, and that was a huge get for my show. And that was a really good show to start off with, but I was also doing the interviews and the production a lot better in that 7th episode than I did in the first 5. So consider that as well when you're developing a better podcast. Well, I want to thank you so much for watching my video today. I hope it's been helpful. If you have any other questions, you want to reach out to me about other ideas, especially when it comes to creativity and making your podcast stand out and developing that better podcast, feel free to do so. I am a podcast consultant along with a podcast producer, so I've been where you are, and now I'm helping other people start their paths or maybe even improve their existing shows. My website is scottmurrayonline.com, and I'm at Twitter at Mr. Scott Murray. And that is something I'm doing on a regular basis right now. So feel free to reach out to me anytime. I want to thank you for listening, and I want to thank the folks at Podcast Movement for giving me the opportunity to share some of my insights in developing a better podcast.